Okay, welcome everyone. So with some 10 minutes delay, we should get started. I see already 44 people managed to access the link, and I hope also via the live stream people can follow in case they cannot get into the Zoom webinar. So dear speakers, dear participants, I am very honored to welcome you to our roundtable event on Navalny and the recent protests in Russia. I am Fabienne Bosseets. As you can see, there are two Fabienne Bosseets in this webinar, but let's say that I'm the real Fabienne Bosseet. The other one is our guest speaker, but hopefully this will not cause too much confusion. So I will be moderating the event on behalf of the Russia platform of Ghent University. Now, before we continue, let me provide you with some technical information and instructions. As attendees of this event, you will not be able to turn on your microphone and camera during the event. If you want to ask questions to the speakers, then you can use the chat to do that. People who are following via the live stream, maybe you can use the chat on the YouTube channel if you have any questions. And I think also those questions might be able to reach us. The questions will be collected by a colleague who will then send them to me. And the final 30 minutes of the event are reserved for answering the questions that you may have. You don't need to wait till then to put questions in the chat, so please feel free to post your questions throughout the discussion. I hear that there is an echo. Okay, this is also annoying, of course. I think I know why. It's because we are logged in with two people in the same account, presumably. Okay, for now I will have to continue. I'm not sure how we can deal with this new technical problem. Maybe if someone who is much more of an expert than I am can tell me what to do, then I will be happy to follow up those instructions. Okay. Someone else say that they don't hear an echo. All is fine there. Okay, another person says there's also no echo. Okay, so it should be fine, right? So I can continue. Okay, good. That's a relief to hear. Okay. So in any case, feel free to post questions in the chat throughout the discussion, so you don't have to wait till the end to do that. Okay, now let's return to the topic of the event. So this evening, together with our four speakers, we will be discussing the person of and the movement around Alexei Navalny. We will also assess to what extent the recent protests are a reflection of a wider societal discontent in Russia, rather than perhaps just direct support for Navalny. And in assessing these questions, we will also ask whether it makes sense to draw parallels with the ongoing protests in Belarus against President Lukashenko. Also, the implications for Russia's political future will be discussed, along with the substantial role played by the media, including also digital and social media. And last but not least, we will also address the question what the EU should do. As Russia's relations with the European Union have further deteriorated over the poisoning, arrest and conviction of Navalny, the question remains what the EU could or should do. To discuss these questions, we have four prominent speakers who will share with us their expert views on these issues. Their expertise is very complementary in the sense that they are each experts on specific questions relating to today's discussion. We were very keen to give a platform to different views on these issues, and therefore we made sure to invite not only speakers from Belgium or Western Europe, but also speakers from Eastern Europe and from Russia. As Western Europeans, we tend to have a very specific view of Russia and of Russian politics, which is, of course, strongly influenced by our Western European views on democracy and politics. So therefore, we believe it's always interesting to be able to listen to the viewpoints of experts who have a more intimate understanding of the local context in Russia. So let me proudly present our four speakers. First of all, we have Professor Dmitry Goncharov. Professor Dmitry Goncharov works at the Political Science and International Affairs Department at the Higher School of Economics in St. Petersburg. So he's now with us live from St. Petersburg. He's also the director of the Political Science Master Program there. He teaches courses on Russian politics, comparative politics, political theory, political participation, and his research interests include Russian politics, democratic theories, and theories of democratization, amongst others. Then next we have Nina Bashkatov, who you now see also as Fabienne Bosset. But so Nina Bashkatov has combined an academic career with journalism. In her capacity as Belgian news correspondent in Moscow, she followed on the spot the tectonic waves that shook the former Soviet Union and Russia, and she's been doing this since 1986. In parallel, she went back to academia and she obtained a PhD based on a dissertation on the energy diplomacy of the Russian Federation, which later also turned into a book. She has been lecturing at different universities and she's currently associate member of the Center for International Relations Studies at University of Liège. Her latest book, which was published 2 years ago, is entitled Poutine, l'homme que l'Occident aime haïr, or in English, Putin, the man that the West likes to hate. Then we also have Alexei Kazarski. Dr. Kazarski received his PhD from Comenius University in Bratislava in Slovakia. He now works there also as a lecturer, and his PhD dissertation was published as a monograph in 2019 and is entitled Eurasian Integration and the Russian World, Regionalism as an Identity Enterprise. Dr. Kazarski has been a visiting researcher at several universities, including the University of Vienna. He previously also worked as a researcher and lecturer at Charles University in Prague. His main interests in terms of research have been Central and Eastern Europe, but also Russia, further also regionalism and regional integration. Then last but not least, we have Rashid Gabdulhakov. He's a PhD candidate and lecturer in the Department of Media and Communication at Erasmus University in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. His research focuses on digital vigilantism, meaning citizen-led justice manifested online. He also works on surveillance and social media affordances. He has recently co-edited the book entitled Vigilant Audiences. Now, without further ado, let's start the discussion. The discussion is structured along 4 sets of questions. The first set of questions focuses on the person of Navalny and the protest movement around him, as well as on the implications for Russia's political future. Let's start off by focusing on the key subject of our discussion, who is Alexei Navalny. Now, Dr. Bashkatov, can you tell us what is the movement around Alexei Navalny? Now, who are his supporters? Are they a uniform group or are they rather a diverse group? Also, has his support base changed over time? Because of course he's been active for quite some time now. Have you seen any change in his support base? I give you the floor. You're still unmuted. You'll have to unmute yourself. Okay, great, perfect. Go ahead.
So I was saying that the basic answer is that Navalny changed in the country, which changed a lot. And of course, the supporters changed because it's all going together. And I think that in the evolution of Navalny, I will point the fact that he saw, I think, with an acute political sense, that the old liberal opposition was not a tool to change the regime, and more importantly, because he's terribly ambitious, what is absolutely normal for a political figure, that he can never get out of this world where people were embittered in big ego discussion, who would be the leader, who would not be the leader. And in the same time, I think that he make the right assumption that, as I say first, he has to get out of that and make a name for himself. that he had to enlarge support geographically and socially, what he has been done, that's what I'm talking of, changed. That he has to find a way to keep the liberal opposition with him, because it was his image of being a liberal and a different man of new figures and so on, but he needed them to, he cannot be rejected by them. But in the same time, he had to find a way not to be trapped by them. That's why we will come to some of the points in the debate later on. And I think he has also the assumption, the real one, that with the world today of communication, that we will talk a lot with Mr. Gabdurkov, he has to be seen as a figure in the West too, because after all, the other countries, they don't care much about who is the president of Russia, is something from the West. And so that's why I have the feeling that his evolution and the evolution of his supporter is a purely political calculation and a well use of a changing situation around.
Thanks. So if I might continue along that question. So what views does he then actually represent? So we know that in challenging President Putin, he focuses mainly on anti-corruption. In fact, he has been described as a nationalist, even as a racist. He's also been criticized for supporting the annexation of Crimea, although he seems to represent a middle ground in that regard, because actually he demands a second real referendum to take place in Crimea. He's also considered to be rather, well, racist towards migrants coming from the South Caucasus and Central Asia. But we do know also that these comments date back from 10 years ago. And in a recent article in the New Yorker, a commentator has described how his views have been evolving and have been changing over time. So how do you look at that? So what are really the views that he represents at this moment, let's say?
There are different points in the question, so I will answer differently. I think that the anti-corruption platform, it's something that I am personally, as a political scientist, I'm very suspicious of the sustainability because it's a good way to mobilize people. But we have seen through so-called street revolutions in the Middle East, in Latin America, everywhere, that the how do you call it, border between anti-corruption move and populism, as we call it today, without giving a proper definition, but still, it's very narrow. And I always think that you cannot build, especially in a country like Russia, where you are lacking basis, you cannot build a purely platform for political movements and parties based only on, not only on corruption, because all the Russians know that they are living in a corrupted country, like many people in the West too. But you know, it's based, in fact, it's when the goal is to build a new society, trust with the authorities, trust with the institution. In fact, it's just doing the opposite, because it's justified the people rejection of institutions, saying they are all rotten and so on. And it's encouraging what are not the best instincts of a population, is to look around, to make gossips turning real things, to look at the plate of your neighbors to see if he doesn't have a piece of meat that you don't have. So I think I'm highly suspicious of that, but as I see, it can be discussed. Concern Crimea, as you say, I mean, supporting Crimea return to Russia, as it was called at the time, was largely partaged, even in the intellectual milieu and so on. It was really seen as a historical revenge, the repairing of a mistake. So he was not very original in supporting. And I was myself, because I was at Moscow at the time, absolutely taken aback by the kind of euphoria, I would say, even unpleasant euphoria because it was too much about Crimea. And I always thought that there was a link between this kind of euphoria, we can do everything, Russia is there and so on, and the clumsy intervention in Eastern Ukraine. So now going back to what you say about the accusation against Navalny. I mean, again, I think there is a tendency today to go in your past and pick up some sentences that you pronounce, even if they were not very recommendable. So that's a kind of a path with no use and abuse, because now you are people who have, you know, coming back with something they made when they were teenagers. I mean, there is something unhealthy in that. So does it mean he's racist? I mean, it means that he's, I think, a terrible opportunist, and it's more dangerous because it means that he seems that he's ready to defend even unpleasant and use unpleasant slogans if he believes that it's gaining support. What he did at the time, because at the time, remember that the Russians were feeling invaded, as they say, by foreigners. So it was meaning Central Asia and Caucasus. What they mean by invasion, it was that they were taken over an entire block of flats, sending their children at school in the quartier where the people feel that they were downgrading the level. You know, the usual kind of when you have people invading, I would say, more your privacy than your country. And so he thought at the time, because as I say, he had to move from the liberal support to something else, the wave was there. He can surf on this kind of feeling, and he did. And remember that he made even something more foolish because he was there encouraging the population, the demonstrators who were gathered at the Manege Square by telling, let's go and take power, you know, like if he wanted to assault the Kremlin. On the other way, you mentioned Gessen. I was reading Evgenia Albast, who were inventing incredibly tortuous explanation where he was not a racist, but he was using what was the meaning, etc., etc. I think that's shocking from people who pass from liberal analysts, because then they enter also in his game that I'm wrapping everything around that can be useful for my career. So I think I talked enough about that.
Sorry, I was muted. So, well, thank you very much. But maybe we can now pass the floor to Professor Goncharov, because another question in this regard is whether Russia, well, imagine, so let's imagine that Navalny would be elected president. Would Russia really be following a different path with Navalny as president?
Well, it's a good question, and it's about the future. And political science is not especially good in the predicting the future, but definitely, well, in my like we are talking about how we can see the what kind of mindset Navalny is having now, and what kind of political project he can shape based on what he is now, and based on what he's doing now. And actually, I have quite a, well, despite all these past happenings and events he was involved in, I have quite a, you know, kind of positive view of his current political position, and he's quite successful in building a network of activities that can be quite potentially quite useful in mobilizing liberal and pro-democratic liberal segment of the Russian society. So definitely talking from what we are witnessing right now, we can expect quite a positive change in Russian politics, in the like quite kind of normal democratic and liberal direction. So that is my. But
okay.
Of course, it's kind of subjective.
Yes, but also, I mean, I know it's a very difficult question to answer. If you knew the answer to that question, I think you would become a very important, influential man. But if we go back to the recent protests, so how do you think they compare or differ to previous ones? And then I'm talking also about both political protests that have taken place in the past, but also more societal ones, such as the pension protests, the trucker protests. If we go back in time a bit further to the Belarusian protests 10 years ago, what do you think is different this time, or is it not that different?
Well, it's different in many ways. The problem is, would those differences be like really important in terms of producing a political change? But 10 years ago, the wave of protest was provoked by massive electoral fraud, which was recognized by those kind of members of new middle class in major urban centers that after years of being quite apolitical and passive came to vote, to voting polls. So 10 years ago, protests started to happening after the elections, and well, I mean parliamentary elections. It was, of course, an important part of the context where the preparations for presidential elections were happening. But to a very significant extent, those who participated in a protest 10 years ago, they were quite naive, and they were not aware of some basic structure of Russian politics. Now we are, after all these years of experience resulted from clearly authoritarian trends in Russian politics. We have more high level of awareness, public awareness about the authoritarian nature of Russian politics, at least in a particular segment of Russian society. So, protests started to happen month before the elections. So this time we have a lot of reasons to foresee more politically focused and more politically structured wave of protest,
Well,
which
actually,
might be a part of a part of this electoral cycle.
Exactly, and this is actually one of the next questions I wanted to ask you. So if we look at the potential of the recent protests and well, let's say their sustainability in the next months, especially in light of the upcoming parliamentary elections. So then the question is, well, could the protests that took place recently and let's say the broader public discontent, could they influence the upcoming Duma elections? And if so, how?
Well, definitely they are already affecting the nature of these particular electoral cycles. So actually, the electoral cycle has begun already, and it definitely all these events, and I guess like a strategy or mobilization, which still are to be revealed by people who are around Navalny in FBK, his anti-corruption foundation. Definitely, the fact that protests will be combined with a number of electoral strategies which were invented and suggested by Navalny and his entourage, and all these will give like a significant strength to this particular wave of election of protest.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, I would like to give the floor back to Dr. Bashkatov. Well, so building on further on this discussion, well, the so-called Crimean consensus that was there, so the political unity that we could see after the Crimean annexation, well, this consensus seems to be eroding. Do you think that the current events or the recent events in Russia are perhaps a sign of weakening of the so-called Putinism in the country? And then what does Navalny's arrest and also the use of force against the protesters tell us about the state of the Russian domestic politics? And also, what does this tell us about the legitimacy of Putin's regime? Could this popular wave of discontent come as a serious challenge to his rule?
It is certainly a challenge because he's not used to that. The proof is the way the regime is reacting. I mean, it's a regime who never knew or even tried to learn how to open a dialogue with people who were different. And that's what I found that that's the main problem of Russia, is that you have a kind of stagnation at the top with a very low level of rotation of personnel. And so they use, I mean, even if they will be the most democrat and the most interested in people, what I doubt, but still they could not function in a society with moving, especially in a Russian society who has been going through so much different events in 30 years. So I think really for me, that's one of the most important problems, and the incapacity to dialogue is of course leading to using of force and repression, because it's the only thing which is left to a power. Does it mean that they are entirely losing grips, and like some people in the West are dreaming or hoping? I think it's to go a little far ahead. But there is a crispation, and I repeat, a feeling for years already that something has to move, people have to change in the presidential administrations, for instance, or different ministry. But that being said, I join Dmitry Goncharov by saying that it is interesting that all those movements are before election and not after. So the problem now is to make sure that this movement can translate in votes. because you can also detect a danger or a weakness in having a movement with saying, you know, everybody, as long as it's not Putin, is good to vote for, as long as not a deputy with a candidacy was supported by the Kremlin is good too. I think it might backfire because even among people who are supporting, even some who are demonstrating, when you discuss with people, they say, but I will not vote for Navalny. I might vote for some of his candidates if I have a sympathy. So I think that you will have first a competition between the different parties, including the so-called party of power, to co-opt people, especially in the region, because there are some people who developed a profile who are perceived by the people, not like those people distant in the Kremlin, decided from Moscow and so on, but people who are ours. They know our problems, they acted, I don't know, to repair a road or a school and so on. And a lot of the regional movements and demonstrations were about regional and even local issues. So I repeat, it will depend how those people will be can be co-opted by one or another party, because it doesn't matter for voters, you know. And the second is by making these things, this kind of votes for everywhere against Putin. I mean, you had already in Soviet time the vote against all, was a way, the only way to express your discontent. And it was kept for a time in Russia, and then it was cancelled. And so he's not inventing something new in a way, to say vote against Putin. But he can simply make the electoral campaign of other opponents of Putin. It can be the nationalists, even if they are not, they are in disarray for the moment, but they represent something. And the communists, of course, because I don't know if some people who are more in contact than me with young people, but I'm astonished how among, for instance, young political scientists, you have not a nostalgia of the communists, but a feeling that liberalism, it has been presented, is not enough. And again, the communists are divided today, including about the support to Navalny, but they are there, they are a force, they are well identified. It's not a link with the past. It's, for me, a projection in the future that you don't want to be a copy of the liberal reforms of the Yeltsin regime. So that's why I say it's fascinating, because the strength was there, the power was there, the will was there, can go in many directions. And Russia is a country where things change very quickly. And that's why people forget about Crimea, because they have other problems. And in 2 years, they can have forgot even at the next presidential election.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, let's perhaps now turn to the question of parallels with the anti-Lukashenko protests in Belarus that have been going on since the presidential elections there last summer. So, Dr. Kazarski, as someone who is from Belarus, you have been very closely following the events in your home country, of course. Could you then tell us what parallels, if any, could be drawn exactly between the recent events in Russia and the protests that are still taking place in Belarus? Or do you think this is perhaps not a question that can or should be asked?
Okay, thanks. So thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm very glad to be part of this great panel. I'll answer the question. I think it is worth answering, but I will add one remark on Russia to what Nina was saying, that things change very quickly in Russia, but I think they tend to not change for a very long time and then change very quickly. That's the typical Russian pattern, I think. As for Belarus, well, I mean, of course, you could draw some parallels. I think there are similarities, but there are also important differences there. And one of them has to do with the scale of the protests, because in Minsk, we had literally hundreds of thousands of people. There are different estimations, but at the peak, there are probably hundreds of thousands in the streets. And also in Moscow, January the 31st, I think you had something like 150 or 200,000 people. Estimations vary. But the thing is, Moscow is, what, 5 times bigger than Minsk? So in proportion, this would have to be something like 1 million in Moscow or more. So I think the scale is not really comparable in this case. Right? The Belarusian protests were much broader. They encompass a broader parts of the segments of the society. Now, what is similar is I think that the kind of root cause here is that the population is psychologically tired of both regimes. But again, I think the extent is different, right? And part of this has to do with the fact that Russia is a much richer country, so it's easier for the government to bribe the people. In Belarus, things have not been looking very exciting from the economic point of view in the recent years. So the government the regime was failing on its so-called social contract, right? That is when political freedoms are exchanged for some kind of economic stability and very modest, I would say, growth. Another similarity, I think, is the kind of network nature of the protests, because this has been a key feature of the protests in Belarus, this kind of horizontal solidarity, horizontal self-organization of the protesters. And I think that something similar is also happening in Russia, and that's where, of course, the social media play a key role. Plus, you have certain political figures that have been either isolated, they were put in prison, or they're not in Belarus. And of course, you cannot organize a revolution from prison. That's pretty difficult even today. And in this sense, these political figures serve as symbols rather than organizers of the protests. And that's, I think, where we can draw another parallel.
Okay, well, if we then move on to look at the response of the Russian regime to the recent protests across Russia, would you say that we see some changes there in how they would have responded previously? So do you think there maybe, well, I'd say it's definitely not less repressive, but do you think that they have learned some lessons or drawn some lessons from what was going on in Belarus since last summer in terms of how to respond to such protest movements? What is your view on that?
Sorry, I muted myself. Well, there's no doubt that they're watching this very closely, that the Kremlin is watching the events in Belarus very closely, right? So there is a number of phobias, right, that the Kremlin is known to have. But again, I mean, I think there are similarities and differences, because in Russia, it is true that there was an unusually brutal crackdown, right? And unusual for Russia, not for Belarus. And some people they're saying that this kind of reminds them of Belarus, of Minsk, that this is in Minsk and Moscow, as they call it. But again, I think the level of violence is different. I mean, Belarus went through a real hell in August, and I mean, this is a terrifying figure that in the UN Human Rights Office, there are several hundred complaints about torture in custody, right? That was, and that's not something we're seeing in Russia, and hopefully something we won't see in Russia. But on the other hand, I think the Russian regime is definitely learning from Belarus, and I think the main lesson is what you may call preemptive brutality, right? So you had these very worrying symptoms, like some people are saying that for the first time in Russia, electric shockers were used so massively, right? Also, an interesting detail I noticed is that they switched off the wireless internet in some places like cafes, and this is of course very reminiscent of Belarus, where every Sunday you would have all internet switched off, including the mobile internet, so that the protesters could not coordinate via social networks. So I think there's quite a bit of learning going on, and the main lesson is that you need to be very tough, right? You need to hit first. That is something that Moscow is learning from Minsk.
Okay, well, a final question when it comes to possible parallels or possible contagion, if we can call it like that. How would you perceive the recent online documentary that was denouncing Lukashenko's wealth? Do you think this was inspired by the online documentary that Navalny released about Putin's secret palace? You know, has this Lukashenko documentary then have a similar impact in Belarus? Like, what was this then suddenly a hot topic? Can you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. Well, I mean, you would need to ask the authors of the movie if they were inspired by by Navalny, but probably yes in some way. I mean, it was made with a similar purpose, right, of educating the broader population on the abuses of the government. The impact. Well, I was watching the movie when it was being live streamed, and there were about 100,000, I think, people watching at the same time. Which again may seem like a small number for Russia, but Belarus has fewer than 10 million people, and by now it's at 5.7. I checked today; it's at 5.7 million views on YouTube. Now, of course, you have people from outside of Belarus watching. That would include myself too. But on the other hand, you have more than one person usually watching that movie on a single device. Right, laptop. So you can get a certain idea of how popular this became. And one of the signs that it did have at least some impact is, of course, that the regime had to react publicly. There was, all sorts of propaganda, counter narratives against the movie, but also Lukashenko himself had to react publicly, which he doesn't openly do usually, right? And he said something like, "I did not learn anything new from that movie," or something like that, which was strange, and nobody quite understood what he meant by that, whether he's acknowledging that all that property is indeed his, or whatever that meant, but he had this strange comment. I think the key difference, though, with Russia is that in Russia, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that many people always sort of realize that the powerful are also the rich, right? That there are these oligarchs, and that's kind of inevitable, and they're so rich, like in the Persian Nights, and that was what made Russia different from Belarus in terms of perceptions, not the reality, but perceptions, perceptions of Belarus in Russia and perceptions of Belarus in Belarus. So Lukashenko always posed as this kind of people's president, that, yeah, he may be a dictator, but he's not like the Russian oligarchs. He's very modest. He doesn't steal from the people. Once he even said that he doesn't have an apartment. He has no place to live in. After his presidential term is over, he's going to have to look for a place to stay. I mean, of course, the people who were always opposed to Lukashenko, they didn't really take this seriously. That was, another reason to turn on the sarcasm. But you have a lot of people now who were apolitical previously, and they were involved in politics in 2020. They got involved, and to them, the movie explains in very simple language, which sometimes also borders on being vulgar, that this guy is no different from the Russian guys. Okay, maybe he has less money, but but the principle is the same. So basically, the movie calls him a crook, quote unquote, and that's something that might have been borrowed from Navalny, because he had his famous slogan, "The Party of Crooks and Thieves," the United Russia.
Okay, well, speaking of digital media and the impact of digital media, let us now turn to the question what role media, including social and digital media, have been playing in the recent protests in Russia. And so for this, I now turn to our fourth speaker, Rashid Gabdulhakov. So everyone saw or heard about the video by Navalny of Putin's $1 billion palace. Everyone is also aware of Navalny's exposure to poisoning attack. Now, how could we gauge the impact of this video and also the news of the poisoning attack? The impact on the Russian population. So what is the impact of Navalny's YouTube videos beyond just mere clicks and views? Do you have an idea of this, and how can this impact be gauged?
Thank you, Fabian. Good evening, everyone. Great pleasure to be here and be part of this discussion. Well, I think a couple of immediate reactions. Everyone, but not everyone, right? Because evidently, and I will bring in some stats from Levada Center on the domestic views in Russia. But of course, the second reaction is to having this discussion beyond likes and clicks and shares. But for me, these are important artifacts, right? As a media scholar, this is exactly what I look at. And it was unprecedented popularity, 100 million views in the first 10 days that the video was out. That magnitude, of course, just shows the significance of these counter narratives, of the narratives that embarrass the regime, expose it domestically, of course, but embarrass it internationally, because in my view, the movie was as much for the domestic audience in Russia as it was for external viewers. Now, I just checked the video today, 115 million views. So the momentum is going down, but nevertheless, it's quite a bit. 4.5 million likes versus 218,000 dislikes. So that means that that to me is also an indicator of the polarization in audiences and audience partisanship when it comes to media products, because obviously those who came to watch this media product, this video, they also invest time into making their position visible, that they like the video and that they want to comment. And having looked at the comments continuously, every now and then I visit and check again, the comments are predominantly anti-regime at this point, which is also quite unusual, because normally you would have a troll army come in and try to sway the discussion, or at least dilute it a little bit with alternative messages. Whereas here it's constant and continuous flow of the specific discourse, specific narrative. Now, of course, that's also indicating of not only the polarization and the partisanship among the viewers, but also the different platforms in which specific products are shown. Of course, in Russian, at this point, the television is predominantly occupied by pro-regime narrative, right? As what Vera Tols and Yuri Tepper called the agitainment, right? Taking the ideologically infected ideological content, adapting it to the local realities, and presenting it in an entertaining manner. It's the political shows that are aired on primetime television across state channels, state-owned or loyal programs and channels. They, of course, are pitching one discourse, and we can go into the abyss of discussion here, but basically the imperial ambition, the conspiracies of the West, the demonization of the West, of course, and it's based on the idea that the West is trying to put Russia back on its knees, but also the cultural backlash points, such as the West being promiscuous or lacking family values, and so on and so forth. So here we see that there is a particular audience that, of course, has to be connected to the internet, has to be a bit digitally savvy, but nevertheless, it was also about displaying this to people beyond Russia. Now, when it comes to those viewers, it's also interesting, because another group of people that I monitor are the Russophones across Europe. who organize themselves into these social media groups, right? Russophones in the Netherlands, Russophones in Germany, Russophones in Europe more broadly. And there in these public domains, the idea of, well, Navalny hasn't appeared much, neither did this video. It was completely ignored. So that's quite amazing to me. Of course, there are editorial positions of group admins, but to me, it's an interesting sign that this was completely, pretty much ignored. Now, when it comes to the audience and seeing who viewed it and how people responded, I'll just have to rely on the data from the Nevada Center, right? So evidently, it's 26% of the adult population who has seen the film, and 62% did not hear about it at all, apparently. So that's quite impressive. That's inside Russia. Of course, there are variations in younger generation, perhaps by virtue of being connected to the internet, but also probably because of other reasons, like the disenchantment in the regime and the entertainment of the product. And of course, the role of Telegram is important here. So when it comes to platforms, they certainly provide an alternative message here.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, what you have been describing so far also is it's like, well, there is already now an intricate confrontation emerging between the narratives that are spread by the traditional pro-regime media and the narratives that are spread by the counter-regime digital media. Could you elaborate a little bit more on this? Because I'm also wondering to what extent this confrontation between these two types of media is changing the face of politics in Russia.
We can judge this by several things. One is, of course, the reaction of the regime to these products that are available on digital media, to digital media platforms, and to audiences. Like I've already mentioned, quite a bit of efforts have been put into instilling control over narratives domestically. Quite a bit has been and continues to be invested into doing the same on the international arena through traditional media platforms like RT or Sputnik. That, of course, also, it's not as crystal clear as in the digital domain is one type of information and traditional media is other type of information, because traditional media penetrate digital media. So we have to be aware of that. And when it comes to the state investing funds and other resources into delivering their strategic narrative domestically or internationally, it's done in a very tailored manner, right? And people invest money into doing it in a local language. It's tailored messages. So I wouldn't differentiate it just in those simple terms. Now, nevertheless, social media affordances, they enable alternative voices, and that is something that is dangerous for the regime, because it can, it questions regime's relevance, stability, even its capacities, right? And because of the accusations that some of the other panelists have already mentioned. So things are done to gain control of the platforms. Of course, much like with the domestic traditional media broadcasters, efforts have been put into appropriating platforms. Like Kontakte is one example, right? And then continues catch, hide and seek with other platforms. And pressure is being put on the global giants, and sometimes unsuccessful, but other times successful, right? For instance, that case when Instagram complied with removing content that exposed Prihodka and Deripaska on a yacht on the shores of Norway. Instagram complied and removed this content. So we already see a bit of compliance. There was a whole brouhaha, of course, was trying to block Telegram, while even the MFA continued to use Telegram, right? And recently, the slowing down of Twitter. So the regime is playing with platforms, seeing what mechanisms of pressure can be applied. At the same time, of course, pressure is simply applied on users and has been applied. That means that there is concern in what type of information people are exposed to. Since 2014, a wave of amendments to criminal code articles, right? 282, 280, 354, 148, and people getting imprisoned for extremism, propagating fascism, spreading inter-ethnic and inter-religious hatred for likes and shares on social media. Of course, some cases might, I did a study on this as well, some cases might have been genuine, genuine accusation and xenophobia. Of course, the question is, so should someone go to jail for that much time for that, right? Or be fined millions of rubles for that? And even though this kind of harsh application of law, which was also quite selective, the law was unpredictable. So sometimes it was genuine, other times it was just random. Anyone could be arrested for virtually anything. That leads to people thinking twice before they post certain comment or share something or even click like. That is, of course, designed to instill a bit of self-censorship here. And even though it has been decriminalized a little bit, it doesn't change the nature of these fears, right? Because you can still get conditional charges and you are still fined quite a bit. And if you repeat the offense, the fines only increase. So there is an attempt to build this kind of Chinese-style firewall, but because it's too late in the process to do this technologically, and there are not that many resources at this point, alternative ways are being sought. One of them is the application of crazy law, bizarre law. It's really bizarre. It's selectively applied, and anyone can be arrested for anything. If there is a person who needs to be arrested with the current conditions, any activity online can be tied to this law.
Okay. Okay, well, thanks. This is extremely insightful. But if we now, for now, leave aside the discussion on the role of the digital media versus the traditional media and so on, we will come back to that in the Q&A because I've seen already some questions about it. But let's now focus on our fourth set of questions, also the final set of questions that we will discuss at this round before we open the Q&A. That is, what could or should the EU do when it comes to the recent protests that have been taken place? Dr. Bashkatov, I would like to come back to you for this question first. Now, we all know that EU-Russia relations remain at an all-time low. Recently, they basically further dropped. And this was, of course, because of the poisoning, the arrest and the conviction of Navalny. Now, what did the EU do in response? Well, the EU then imposed further sanctions. Do you think that this will have an impact? I mean, a further deterioration of the EU-Russia relationship? Or do you think, well, the relationship is already so bad that at this stage, imposing sanctions will not necessarily affect this relationship?
Well, you know, the EU, they need to make some gestures. They like that. And to say that something can deteriorate is very difficult to see how, because we have been going from bad to worse. And somehow, somewhere, there is no definitive breakup because nobody needs it and wants it and will do it. You know, it's for years that I'm starting lectures about the EU-Russia relation by saying, as last year, I can tell you that we start with the terrible relations, and it's going on and on and on. And I think you have to go back to the basis of the problems. And I would say there are two main. One is that, no, the global one is that no partners never knew what to do with the other. They knew they had to do something, that they were sharing the same continent, that they have somewhere some interest in keeping this continent not too poor and not too unstable. But that was it. So on the methods, there has never been further discussions. And then from the Russian side, you had, I think, a kind of looking down at EU, not in the beginning, because in the beginning, it's always like that in Russia. They were all besotted with Russia and European values and so on and so on. And then, of course, they are faced with reality and the part of a lack of knowledge also at the time when it's deteriorated about what were the functioning of the EU. Because many things that they were accusing the Europeans were in fact linked to the fact that they didn't read the treaties. Of course, they are not the only one, but that they didn't have a deep knowledge about the complexity of the European Union. So they tended to say, you know, it's bad will. In fact, they don't want to have relations. They don't want consider as equal partners, and so on and so on. And then there is also the basic difference that Russia has national interests like the US, and that EU don't. So they invented this thing that now they are different of the others because of the values, but I'm sorry to look a little cynical, but when you are confronted with real problems of real risk of deterioration up to a certain point, I mean, values are something that you accommodated, and it's very easy because it's not written black and white. You know, you can say human rights and so and so. And in which order do you serve them? You see, there is a lot of misperception who has been there on the basis. And now you have also to put in the picture that Russia has very often been used when there were division and that nobody wanted to take a lead in something too strong. And then there was this slogans, let's not Putin divided us. I mean, everybody heard that for 1,000 times. In fact, it was hiding a kind of impotence, and also the fact that bilateral relations were continuing despite the EU level decision, and that Russia, of course, had all interest to deal at bilateral level because it's more efficient. If only you forget all the attempt to divide the EU and so on. I mean, EU is divided without the need of Russia. And then you have the confusion is another element that I would ask now, is the question of the US. I mean, the pressure of US on European decision-making process is huge, and it's not transparent. And that's one of the things which is frustrating, perhaps the Russians, but certainly the Europeans. And now you have this declaration, you know, you have this big hope, Trump is gone, and now we have a complete change. And then we had to face again that America first is under the Republicans and the Democrats, and that we have to cope because they can divide it for the interests of the United States. And then you have this declaration of Biden. I mean, what do you do with that? I'm sure that in all the diplomatic circles in EU level, they almost fell from their chairs because it's almost the kind of Trumpist kind of ex-cathedra declaration without even thinking of what he's saying, because he's the president of the United States, who of course has been trapped, but a very skilled interviewer with a specialist in foreign policy. But that's showing also a kind of dangerous amateurism, just that we don't have the tweets anymore. So we'll see how it will wait on the European Council of next week when they have to examine the question of sanctions. But I mean, EU is a very late convert to the use of sanctions for political gains. So they have also to indoctrinate almost themselves to consider that more sanction would be a good political tool. And we don't have the American way of using sanction more and more for settling economic rivalries through the world, including with EU. So that's the pattern. So we'll see what they will decide. Probably some more sanctions, but not meaning much, because I mean, the idea of EU is to also, you know, it's like to have your cup and the coffee and everything together without decision. And so the idea is that they want to make sanctions, who will sanction oligarchs who are close to Putin, who were making the regime surviving without touching the ordinary Russians, who will understand how they have an interest to vote for somebody else. I'm sorry, I have more and more difficulty to buy that.
Okay, thank you. Well, maybe we can turn back to Professor Goncharov. Maybe it would be also interesting to hear this from a Russian perspective, not necessarily from your personal perspective, but more from a Russian perspective. So I know that you're not necessarily an expert on foreign policy, but nevertheless, it would be interesting to hear from you how Russia has been looking, well, first of all, of course, at the latest sanctions that the EU imposed over the poisoning and the arrest and the conviction of Navalny, but then also about the likelihood that there will be a new alliance again between European Union and the US. How do Russians, well, in let's say the Russian regime, how does the Russian regime look at this? Is this for them really a threat? And do you think that this could lead really to a detrimental rupture between the EU and Russia if such an alliance between, well, a strong alliance between the EU and US would take place?
Yeah, I think that it's a very important development in international relations, in Russia-West relations. So it's definitely, I'm pretty sure that from the Russian perspective, from the perspective of, I've already seen some, kind of signs that people from like Russian international relations academia, they are, some of them are kind of, they serve as their interpreters of the official positions of the Russian government. And I see that they are quite kind of concerned with these prospective alliance between Europe and US. Like back in Trump years, that was probably like one of the biggest disadvantages in the united Western approach to Russian domestic political developments. So Russia did benefit a lot from the fact that Trump was kind of anti-European American president and tried to do everything to build a quite high level of hostility between the United States and Europe. And that was quite beneficial for Russia, and it did create a very comfortable international context for Putin and his entourage here in Russia. So it's like I guess that well, sanctions is in general it's very tricky issue. So it's still not clear how they can work to produce some change in Russian politics, but the general change in the structure of international relations with a higher level of common understanding and common activities on the side of Russia and European Union might be a very uncomfortable development in the international context of for Russian political activity.
Okay, thank you. Well, maybe as a final question then, before we move on and start the Q&A, Rashid, if I may take the honor of asking the final question to you. So following up, of course, still on what the EU should do or the possible consequences of a new alliance between the EU and the US in terms of the relationship, the future relationship between the EU and Russia. So what about the expression, if you want peace, prepare for war? So do you think that maybe a battle is necessary in order to reestablish more constructive relations between the EU and Russia on a new basis? Or would you say, well, no, there are definitely other less confrontational alternatives that could lead to an improvement of the relationship between the EU and Russia?
Okay, Fabian, let me react to this, but also through the media perspective, right? Because we have discussed, we opened the discussion. One of the questions concerned the future, and of course, prediction is quite a bit speculative, but what's known, what's comfortable for people is the past. So in the media, I also see quite a bit of return to the past familiar grounds, as in who we define as enemies, who we define as allies, right? So that familiar ground of the Cold War era, that imperial ambition, the role of World War II, the continuous reminder that, hey, if you dare teach us how to live, we will repeat Berlin, style, and so on. So these ideas are penetrating the Russian media domain. Of course, the demonization of Russia is also something that is present across media in the West. Well, even the way the West, right, framed is, it's like one homogeneous entity, but is it really? Look at the EU. There are countries that are Eurosceptic, and there is also the rightist populist lobby that are in awe with Putin and Putin's regime. So who is fighting whom is a good question, because when you have a war, you have two sides, but you also have the counter forces and counter forces, so to speak. So to me, from the media perspective, the biggest danger that I see is in this demonization of each side, which of course is a product of that political confrontation, but it will echo on the ground at the grassroots level between the people, and it already echoes. So I notice this again, a bit of human everyday perspective is important to bring into the discussion as well, right? I notice it among the students who come from Russia and who carry this weight on their shoulders, right? That weight of the political ambition of the political elites in their country, to which they almost are asked to respond here by their peers and so on. But nevertheless, of course, while demonization is taking place on both sides, the EU has to stand up by its values and has to confront the regime, because with this regime, while Putin is in power, there will be no establishing any form of compromise, unfortunately. So for this, but within this battle, it's a matter of waiting and hoping that something more coherent will come after, because the regime is built on demonization of the West and the reminder of those historical narratives of romanticizing war. On this lovely note, I will end. Thanks.
Okay, well, thanks. Well, I think it's time now to open the floor for the questions from the audience. So my colleagues have in the meantime gathered all the questions. There have been quite a few questions raised, and they touch upon various issues, of course, issues that have already been discussed. So I think we can go back more or less in the order of the set of questions that we followed to structure the discussion. And so a first question relates then to the support base of Navalny. So one of the attendees was wondering whether there is any knowledge of the percentage of the Russian population that support Navalny. Do we really know this? I believe this is probably a difficult question. I'm not sure whether any studies have already shown percentages, but maybe Nina, I don't know, do you have a view on this? You are still muted. Yes, there you are. Okay.
So I don't have access to things that nobody had before me and together with me. I think I would add more credibility to what is published from Levada, with probably the most generous that you can have, but also credible. And so he was going for 3-4% to 8-9, but probably Dmitry will know more precise.
Okay, so yes, we can ask Dmitry. So do you have a more accurate idea of this?
Recent polls, they tell that it's like the approval of Navalny is somewhere like around 16 or 17%. So it's, but the public recognition of him increased significantly after the this video about Putin's palace, and actually, like now Navalny, he was banned. His name, well, you know, like Putin never, you know, mentioned his name publicly, and Navalny, like even his name was like totally banned from the Russian television. But recently, a lot of propaganda materials started to appear. Well, I saw nothing of that. I have no television in my house, but it's kind of a big deal that finally television started talking about Navalny. Well, of course, in an extremely negative way, but still it helped enormously to boost his public recognition.
Yes, well, actually, a follow-up question that was also raised in the chat is very much linked to this. So whether the time that he's now spending in prison, whether that will add further credit to his popularity. But I guess based on what you're saying, yes, I guess the answer is yes. Presumably this will give a boost to his popularity even further.
Well, not like exactly popularity. So it's like it's kind of a difficult concept. But definitely it has led already to the significant increase in his public recognition and awareness. So people, like across all social groups and like across all political identities in Russian.
This is another question. This is actually another question that was raised in the chat, and which was specifically for you. The question was, so what kinds of segment of the Russian society is now supporting Navalny and the protests? Because yeah, they say that you were referring to this segment, so they would like to know which ones you mean.
Well, when we talk about Navalny, it's probably it's not so important like how many people like would support him exactly. Well, because he's a very important and influential figure in Russian politics, but it does not necessarily mean that like everyone would like vote for him if he runs for the president office.
Yeah, this is another question. Exactly, like whether they would vote for him.
Yeah, but he and the movement which is behind him, like a rather structured movement, they suggested a very powerful instrument to challenge the political monopoly and domination of United Russia and probably even Putin himself. So it's like this smart voting or умное голосование strategy, which is like very closely associated with his name, might play a rather significant role in the elections later in the year. And also it might be a part of the context to boost the protest wave, which is, I'm pretty sure, is going to happen later in this year, in summer. Because it's like all these strategies which are and like actions which have to be taken to implement this strategy might be also used as instruments and strategies for political anti-regime political mobilization across many political segments of the Russian society.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Nina, you have raised your hand. I assume you would like to add some insights to what was already mentioned. You are still muted.
Sorry.
No problem.
Well, I just wanted to add to what Dmitry was saying. It means that it depends, and also your question, it depends what we are measuring. Because the figures, you can have figures, but the polls or the institute who made these polls are measuring or the intention of vote with one thing, or do you know the person of Navalny, which of course has been increasing spectacularly because of the publication, and even know that he's a target for critics. So it means that his name and his person is there. So after all, it's like the stars in Hollywood. The important is that people talk of you. But be cautious not to mix the intention of votes, who are quite low, honestly.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so then another question which relates to this discussion is, well, still, what about the idea that Navalny is not necessarily supported by the Russians, but that Russians do support or sympathize with his anti-corruption ideas? So how can we still look at this? Because it's still, this also goes back to an earlier question that we raised during the discussion. So to what extent still do we see that people are protesting, not necessarily in support of Navalny, but rather in support of his broader idea, the anti-corruption idea, of course, but also the broader societal discontent that we currently witness in Russia? So Nina, maybe you can also elaborate on this point.
Yes, I think that we have to go back a long time ago. I mean, almost as long as I have been working in Moscow, I knew protest against corruption. You have all the colored revolutions in 2004-5 were all based on protesting against corruption. And somebody was mentioning, I remember, I think it's Rashid, about the effect on the population and the people who wanted to live like poor people and so on. Remember Saakashvili, who wanted to live in the 2 bedrooms, would be his office and his family house. And then, you know, he finished with also his own palace, but in Georgian style. You have that in Ukraine too. And I mean, the problem is that you think that you tend to believe that all those countries have been unable to equip themselves with a system of relations between the different circles of a society without corruption. And I think that the difference is that in Soviet time and early Russian time, everybody can get something of corruption. It can be just on your small level that you are taking back home some soap for washing the dishes, or a pair of shoes that you subtracted from the shops or something like that. And today, I think for 10 years now, ordinary people are suffering of corruption, including in their ordinary life, but they were not during the 10 first days when the society was in boom and everybody had the feeling they can get rich, and that's why they were silent, including the middle class. And then now you are in a system which is more frozen, in a way like in our societies, where the society is terribly polarized between those who profit of the system and those who don't. And so now ordinary people have no way to benefit from corruption. They are just at the losing end. And that's why you can mobilize people, but you have to offer them more than simply fighting corruption, because it tends to be a model who repeat itself. And then the other thing too is that this anti-corruption, the same things were appearing in different movements of anti-regime. It can be not only in the former Soviet Union or Central Europe or North Africa, but they tend to replicate. So you have the feeling of a kind of pattern who has been designed once for all, where you come with a film about that and a film about that. I mean, remember the story of the Palace of Putin. I mean, it's in the public for 12 years. We had before the Medvedev Palace, and we had a lot of things. And I repeat, it's part of a strategy probably to conquer power, but it's not a good way to keep people to politics. That's it.
Okay, well, there's still quite a few questions, so I should probably move on. But another question that was raised relates to the pro-Navalny Russians, whoever they are, because I think they are quite a diverse group. But the question is whether these people are perhaps romanticizing the EU and the West. Now, I think this is not an easy question because it's such a diverse group, it probably really depends on what segment of society they represent. But maybe, Dimitri, you can try to answer this question to some extent. So the question is whether pro-Navalny Russians are romanticizing the EU and the West.
Well, probably to some extent, but I do not believe that this generation is like too, kind of. They know how life works in Europe. So, like, especially those who live in Moscow and St. Petersburg, they have most of them, probably all of them, have rather kind of rich experience visiting. Like especially in St. Petersburg, so like Helsinki is kind of a suburban area to some extent for St. Petersburg. We are closer to Helsinki now than to Moscow, or in some ways. So it used to be like back in my days as a young man. So when in late Soviet Union, we did romanticize, we did idealize life in the West. So we know nothing actually about what was going on over there in terms of some real lifestyles and so on. But now it's not about. I think that people, this generation, and the young people who are members of the Navalny's movement, they are rather much more pragmatic, and they are more concerned with the domestic political development in Russia. So they know basic principles, well, some probably in some kind of idealized way, basic principles of how liberal democracy works or should work. But still, I would not say that they have like too idealized or romanticized view of the West in general. So it's quite different generation, more kind of cosmopolitical.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. Well, Alex, I would like to turn to you now, because there was also a question about, well, the idea that, Navalny is a creation of the West to construct an artificially opposition. But we have already looked into this, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit on this, but also from the perspective of what is going on in Belarus, and to what extent we're also witnessing such attempts attempts by the regime to demonize the opposition leaders and to also say that these are just attempts by the West to create an artificial opposition.
Okay, well, that's a very interesting construction of the West, which says that Crimea is not a sandwich and that it can now just be given back to Ukraine. I mean, we've mentioned this this fact that he's, I think, in favor of a second referendum. I mean, pardon me, but that might look like very generous from the Russian perspective, but imagine that somebody comes into your country and tells you, okay, let's have a referendum on, I don't know, part of Belgium or Holland joining another country, right? So how would you react to that? So if he's a construction of the West, that's a very interesting construction. I haven't seen, I rarely see pro-Western politicians like that. In general, I don't think it's. I'm not sure how interesting this is in terms of commenting on propaganda, because the narrative is very old, and I mean, some of these notions are very deep seated. You know, about the evil West and the heroic Russian civilization that opposes the West. I think, in practical terms, we've if this was ever a question, now we have an answer that you cannot organize a revolution from the outside, because if you could, it would have been done a long time ago. Let's say in Belarus. But you cannot. You need some indigenous dynamics, which will at some point be triggered into something like we saw in Belarus in August and later on. So really, I mean, I don't know what to say. This narrative is old, and I mean, arguing with it is kind of strange because.
There is another question. There's another question for you, well, which is slightly related to the previous question, namely whether, well, if we want to call it successful, so the relatively successful crackdown on the recent Russian protests, whether this could weaken or otherwise negatively influence the protests in Belarus in the near future.
Whether the crackdown is going to have an impact?
Well, let's say that the crackdown of the protests in Russia was relatively successful. So could this weaken the protest movement in Belarus, or could it negatively influence the protest movement in the near future?
I mean, I don't see how. I mean, of course, it's not very inspiring. And to begin with, change in Russia would probably bring change in Belarus as well. But like I already said earlier, Belarus went through a special kind of hell in August, which fortunately did not come to Russia and hopefully will never come to Russia. So it's what happened in Russia, the crackdown is a light version of what was going on in Belarus, let's put it this way. So I don't see how it might have a major impact on Belarus. I think the indigenous dynamics are more important, and we shouldn't overestimate, you know, the influence of outside forces.
Okay, well then there's also a question for Rashid. So the question, I think, comes from someone who's definitely an academic, because it's written in a rather academic way. But the question is whether the recently imposed rules about online behavior undercut the idea of rule of law and increase the discretionary power of the regime. If so, how will this increased discretionary power affect political and economic incentives or behavior? I see it's a question from our previous director of the Russia platform, who is an economist. I see. Okay. Rashid, the floor is yours.
It's a pleasure. I will answer this, but maybe with a, again, with a media flair to it, right?
Yeah.
it's interesting to frame it in the domain of the rule of law. Yeah, certainly it is the rule of law, but it's a very different type of rule of law. Like I already mentioned, it's applied selectively. That means that the law is an instrument in the hands of those who operationalize it. If we look at some of the narratives for which people receive sentences or fines, for instance, there are some untouchables, right, in terms of themes. One untouchable is protest. If you tweet about protest, like protest, share, you will go to jail. Well, your chances increase, right? And if you do that on Kontakte, your chances are even higher. If you touch the Orthodox Church, and if you touch the Crimea, Ukraine theme, and of course, if you criticize the elites. First, this was kind of just happening as a systematic response, but now it's sealed in the law as well, right? Because of anti-fake news, the law countering disrespect towards the political elites and so on. The way these laws are called is also quite fascinating, right? The freedom of speech law, amazing, or the anti-fake news law. Some of them are actually even copied from the West. So we like the German so-called Facebook law, right? That puts pressure on platforms to weed out fake news or disinformation is now successfully implemented in Russia to silence the dissenting voices. How will that play on Russia's market? Well, I guess we can talk about the digital tools that are available to people is of no interest to the regime. What is of interest is to silence the alternative voices that are certainly prominent. And we see that some of the affordances of digital media, like the channels on Telegram, they're especially bothering to the regime, and they will be targeted predominantly. And I think one other point I want to make, we have touched upon who are these mysterious Navalny supporters. We cannot, while I'm certain we cannot portray one homogeneous group here, they're different. Some probably support him because they oppose Putin. Some support him because they're genuinely in support of Navalny. He is a politician. After all, politicians tend to have supporters. Let's say there is another group that I want to bring into the discussion and to frame them as a group that doesn't support Putin. So Putin began sort of his reign with instrumentalization of youth, yeah, the movement walking together, идущие вместе, and наши, yeah, ours, the patriotic pro-regime groups that eventually were repackaged into vigilante groups like Stop Ham, Хрущи Против, and so on and so forth, groups that used as a facade idea for something happening at the societal level where youth activists are countering societal problems. Now, there is a disconnect at this point between the aging leader and the digitally savvy youth at this point. And the digitally savvy youth now is not like in 2005, 2008. To them, Putin is not an admirable leader. So new efforts will be put into exactly instrumentalizing them, whether by winning the minds and hearts, which at this point is problematic and virtually impossible, or by force, which the latter is more likely.
Okay, wow, thanks. Strong language, I would say, but it does bring me to the next question that I have here. I would say it's probably the $1 million question. It's not the $1 million palace, but the $1 million question. Namely, whether in the current political situation in Russia and also the current political system that was created and consolidated over the years under Putin, whether there is really a chance for an alternative and for a more democratic and fairer kind of governance. Nina, I think I will give this question to you, but if you want, you can also pass it on to someone else. But I will first give the floor to you, and you'll have to mute yourself. Okay, there you go.
Yes, I do. I think we have to make a difference between another president and another practice and a total change. I think that you cannot expect to have somebody be elected in Russia by being radically different and adopting a radical different position. I mean, Russia will stay Russia, and the Russians, unless the Russians who are there say the opposite, I would believe it, but I always had the feeling that they were asking about, they had the same expectation towards leaders, and one of them being, you know, the great idea that Russia is a great country, that their people are under that their culture. I mean, for instance, to come back to Biden, to say that Putin has no soul. I think that you have to be totally ignorant of what it's meaning in Russians to say that a person has no soul. And so I think we will be wrong. What we can expect, it's, for my money, somebody coming very quickly out of the shadow of Putin, who will be younger, with a different set of mind, with some range of trust who will last at least, let's say, for a year or two, and who would, yes, inspire confidence and giving the feeling that we can restart something. Because I think that in Russia, people not necessarily dislike the person of Putin, but they dislike even not the regime, but what they are living in it. They are a little confused, of course, outside intellectual and academic circles where you can identify more what you want. I think that they want to be treated like normal people, and that when you are abroad, to be Russian is not immediately being asked questions about people in jail and the gulag and so on and so on. That when there is a Russian film which is projected abroad, is not analyzed only in terms of signals against the regime and denunciations of the role of that or that. I mean, there is a need for normality, and I think that Putin doesn't give this feeling anymore. And on the Western side, I think they would be also happy to have somebody who is not controversial, who will not go over the top like you had with the transition in the 90s, but who will, in a way, give a green light for the West without discrediting itself, to be able to regain some type of relations. And that's why I have some expectation about the result of the parliamentary election, because it can be at least a sign of another rapport de force, and that systematically the parliament will not be used as a rubber stamp because it's dominated by people who owe everything to the power. So that's one thing. And the other, I think, from the West then, no go over the top about what you want to do, what you can do, etc., and then see Putin's fingers beyond anything that is happening in the West. I mean, the American election, the Brexit, I mean, the COVID, soon we will learn. So there is something, a kind of normalization of mind in the West. And then to come back to something that Rashid was mentioning, but the question, if you want peace, prepare for war. Well, I think that EU is now in the temptation, because they are so happy to get rid of Trump, to re-begin this kind of confusion between EU and NATO. And if you go back to the relations between the West and Russia, and especially the Europeans, you see that one of the problems and the basis has been that the enlargements, we were after all coming to their borders, was made by under more the influence of Washington than Brussels at a certain point, and that in some case, like, was very clear if you go back to the text published at the moment of attempt to enlarge to the Baltic states, that those people were not interested so much in EU, perhaps in the money, but they were interested to be in NATO. And they were putting themselves not in the shelter of Brussels, but in the shelter of Washington. And still there, and I see now a lot of analysis and texts who are published in Brussels, EU, I mean, not Brussels, Belgium, about more convergence and the dividing of tasks and so on. I think we really need to go back to deterrence after having made so much effort to denuclearization. You see, we have the feeling to fall back, and you cannot hide yourself all the time in the back of Putin. You have sometimes to address the responsibility of the decision taking in the West for supposedly our Western interest.
Okay, thank you. There's still, actually there are questions also relating specifically to the EU and how it should respond to the recent events in Russia. But There are two more questions, which are specifically then about Russia's political future. And so the question is as following. So does Navalny really want to run for president? Wouldn't he prefer to just stay in opposition? Because some experts apparently say that he only wants to lead a revolution that removes the power of the current leaders. Maybe Dimitri, maybe you can try to comment on this.
Yes, Navalny definitely would like to run for presidency, but of course he cannot do that right now and probably in the near future. Navalny is a kind of a good political animal, and he belongs to these, I would say, like to the second post-Soviet generation of civil and political activists. So it's like the first generation was a kind of a continuation of rather elite, narrow, kind of dissident movement, like morally driven, ideologically driven. And Navalny belongs to this next generation, which started to grow from the bottom up, and he's a representative of rather broad, like not overwhelmingly broad movement in the Russian society, but rather broad movement, like a lot of people is behind him, and also like a lot of people would support him in his political fight in the future. So definitely he would like to be, he's already a leading oppositional figure in Russia, and would like to be a kind of a candidate, presidential candidate in the future.
Well, for the next question, I would like to stay with you because, so apparently according to a poll conducted by the Levada Center, and that was released on 11 March, so very recently, the United Russia Party was polling at just 27% support. Could you perhaps draw some predictable consequences? Whether this very poor result could be confirmed at the September elections, because that would probably be the end of Putinism as we know it.
Well, the electoral domination of like United Russia or Putin himself, they do not result from the kind of free vote of people. So this is a result of a very massive machine of electoral manipulation and fraud. So, and the upcoming elections will not be like exclusion to these rules. So the results of this election will depend on the ability of like regime to continue to be effective in the use of this machine of manipulation and fraud. Again, Navalny is important not just like a single possible candidate for like presidential office or whatever. He is a kind of partly like a technical driver and partly a symbol of this strategy of voting, which he called умное голосование, smart votings. And it might be, well, actually, there is a key point behind this strategy is not to to secure electoral victory for Navalny himself, or even for those who are around him. The key point is to undermine the political monopoly of United Russia and like Putin's political machine. So the key, like the main intrigue of the upcoming elections is would evolve around these prospective strategies of how to use coming from different segments of Russian political arena, how to use this strategy of smart voting to benefit, how to benefit from that. And I have a lot of a kind of expectations related to that, and I do not foresee that like pro-democratic or liberal parties like Yabloko or something like that would be like primary beneficiaries of this strategy. I would foresee that the communists and nationalists would take the lion's share of kind of protest votes within these framework of smart voting, and that might bring some change, not like immediate change, but some change to the nature of Russian politics.
Okay, well, at least I think that is an important insight to share. And I think it's also going to be our last insight for this evening, because I've seen that we have run out of time. There were not many questions left, and I believe actually we had already touched upon them previously in the discussion. So, but yeah, dear speakers, dear participants, we have come to the end of our roundtable discussion on Navalny and recent protests in Russia. I really hope that you have enjoyed listening to the discussion. Let me end by thanking our four speakers for their very insightful discussion on all these issues. Let me also thank everyone who contributed to organizing the events, because actually behind the scenes, quite a few people were helping to organize the event. And as you see, still we managed to have start on a, well, less positive note with all the technical issues, although we managed to overcome them, thankfully. But I would like to thank in particular the co-director of the Russia platform, Professor Ben Doge, and also our coordinator, Delphine Klutz, without their help, this event would have not been possible. So special thanks to them. Okay, so I wish you all a pleasant rest of the evening. I hope that we will reconvene again soon for another discussion. But for now, goodbye everyone, and hopefully see you soon online or physically. All the best.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye, thank you.
Oh, that's nice.